20 of America's 25 largest cities reported budget gaps for fiscal year 2026, not 2, not 5. 20 out of 25. In a 5-month stretch between December 2024 and April 2025, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. all had their credit ratings downgraded. Dallas, Denver, Houston, Jacksonville, all of them staring at deficits they cannot explain away, cannot grow their way out of, and in several cases cannot even fully quantify. This is not a recession story. The economy is not in free fall. Unemployment is not spiking. These cities are going broke in what is nominally a functional economic environment. That is what makes it alarming. This is the story of what is actually happening to American municipal finances right now, which cities are closest to the edge, and what it means for the people who live in them. Most people assume cities go bankrupt the way individuals do, overspend, run out of money, cannot pay the bills. That's part of it, but the more common mechanism is slower and harder to see. Cities have 2 categories of obligations: current spending, police, fire, roads, schools, parks. That is the visible stuff. And then there's the deferred obligation, pensions and retiree health benefits promised to workers decades ago, funded inadequately year after year, because paying for the future is politically harder than spending on the present. For most of the last 30 years, cities kicked the pension can. They promised generous retirement benefits during boom times. They underfunded those promises during the lean years. They used optimistic investment return assumptions to make the math look better than it was. And the rating agencies mostly went along with it. Now the bill is due. Chicago has $36 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. Its worst-funded pension plans, police and fire, are approximately 25% funded. For every dollar promised to a retiring Chicago cop or firefighter, the city has set aside 25 cents. New York City is facing growing concerns about its fund balance ratios, with the city comptroller warning in March 2026 that reserves and end-of-year surplus were poised to erode sharply. San Francisco has a structural deficit that its own budget analysts describe not as a temporary downturn, but as a fundamental reset. These are not small cities. These are not poorly managed backwaters. These are Chicago and San Francisco and New York, and the money is running out. Chicago's budget situation is the most documented and arguably the most dire of any large American city. The numbers are specific and they are damning. The projected budget deficit for fiscal year 2026 is $1.15 billion. That is the largest budget gap in the city's history outside of the peak of the COVID pandemic. In 2027, the projected shortfall is $1.16 billion. In 2028, $1.225 billion. The deficits are not shrinking. They are growing every year. Pension expenses alone consume $907.8 million from Chicago's general fund in 2025. That is nearly $1 billion out of a city budget of roughly $12 billion, going to pay retirement obligations before a single police officer shows up for work, before a single pothole gets filled, before the lights stay on in a single school. New York City spends roughly 17% of its budget on pensions and debt service. Los Angeles spends about 11%. Chicago spends 40%. For every dollar Chicago takes in, 40 cents goes directly to paying past promises. That is double what any comparable city spends, and the share is growing. The city's 4 pension funds are funded at an average rate of about 25 to 42%, depending on the fund. The national benchmark for a healthy pension fund is 90%. Chicago's police and fire funds are at 24.5% funded. The city's chief financial officer has described them as technically insolvent. In January 2025, Standard & Poor's downgraded Chicago's general obligation bonds to BBB. That is just a few notches above junk status. When your bonds are near junk, you pay higher interest rates to borrow money. When you pay higher interest rates, you have less money for services. When you have less money for services, people and businesses leave. When people and businesses leave, you have a smaller tax base. When you have a smaller tax base, the deficit gets worse. That is the cycle. Chicago is in it. The city council last year unanimously voted down Mayor Brandon Johnson's proposed a $300 million property tax hike. The political will to raise revenue is absent. The structural problem is not. San Francisco's budget crisis has a specific origin story that makes it different from Chicago's pension problem. It grew too fast on too narrow a foundation, and when that foundation shifted, the whole structure wobbled. Between 2010 and 2020, San Francisco's budget expanded from $6.6 billion to $12.3 billion, an 86% increase. Chicago grew its budget by about 50% in the same period. Los Angeles grew by 52%. San Francisco nearly doubled. The money was coming from a booming tech industry and a red-hot real estate market. City leaders built programs, hired workers, and made commitments based on the assumption that the growth was permanent. It wasn't. Remote work hollowed out the downtown. Office vacancy rates hit record highs and stayed there. The retail and restaurant economy that depended on office workers collapsed. Tax revenues tied to commercial real estate started falling. The city's population declined. Then federal COVID relief money, which had been patching over the structural gap since 2020, ran out. The result was a 2-year projected deficit of nearly $1 billion when San Francisco's mayor called for $400 million in ongoing cuts in December 2025. By March 2026, the projected deficit had been reduced to $643 million through cuts. But the mayor's own words were, "We are not out of the woods. If we don't act now, we will have to do twice as much in the coming years." San Francisco's budget is around $16 billion, a deficit of $643 million. Even after significant cuts, represents roughly 4% of that total. That sounds manageable. It is not manageable when the structural problem hasn't been fixed, when the city has cut what it can cut for now, but the underlying revenue base remains weaker than it was, and the programs that were built during the boom still exist on paper. The credit downgrade came in early 2025. It was not the last one. Houston's fiscal problem is different from Chicago's and San Francisco's. Chicago has a pension crisis. San Francisco had a revenue collapse. Houston has a compounding disaster problem. The city sits in a floodplain and has been hit by multiple severe storms over the past decade. After Hurricane Harvey in 2017 and Hurricane Beryl in 2024, and multiple flooding events between them, court rulings found the city had been negligent in its drainage infrastructure. Houston was ordered to spend $100 million on street repairs and drainage by mid-2025. That $100 million expands the annual budget deficit to $330 million. This is not because of mismanagement. It is not because of excessive pension promises, though those exist too. The city is being held legally responsible for the predictable consequences of infrastructure it did not maintain, in a climate that is delivering more storms more frequently. Houston City Controller Chris Hollins told the Pew Charitable Trust that the city budget is not structurally balanced, and it has not been for some time, and that the situation has worsened recently. His office's own projections show the city facing deficits in the hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 5 years, even under optimistic economic scenarios. The city's rainy day fund is already below its own 15% target, having been drained to cover operating expenses. Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States. Its economy is driven by the energy sector and a massive port. It is not poor. It is not badly governed by historical standards. It is a wealthy, functional American city that is being slowly financially crushed by the physical costs of the climate it exists in. That is a new kind of municipal fiscal crisis. Houston is the clearest example of it. New York City's fiscal situation is the most carefully watched and the most complicated, because New York is so large that even a small percentage shift in its finances represents billions of dollars. The City Comptroller's Office issued a warning in March 2026 that New York's credit ratings face meaningful downside risk. The central concern is that reserves and the end-of-year surplus are poised to erode sharply in fiscal year 2026. Moody's Ratings Available Fund Balance Ratio, a key metric for bond ratings, turned negative in fiscal year 2024, and barely recovered to near zero in 2025. A projected near 50% drop in the city's reserve stabilization fund balance and a 94% reduction in end-of-year prepayment surplus could push the ratio back into negative territory. New York City has the highest tax burden of any major American city. Its total debt in 2021 was $171.5 billion. Per taxpayer, that works out to roughly $56,900. The city has been reducing that debt, but the structural pressures are not easing. A 2022 state law requires the city to hire thousands of additional teachers to cap class sizes, at an estimated cost of more than $1 billion annually when fully phased in. Federal funding cuts are reducing revenue at exactly the moment when mandated spending is increasing. New York will not go bankrupt. It is too large, too connected to state finances, and too important to the national economy for that to be allowed to happen. But won't go bankrupt is not the same as is financially healthy. The city is heading toward the kind of sustained fiscal stress that results in deteriorating services, deferred maintenance, and a slow erosion of quality of life. The kind of thing that is easy to ignore right up until it isn't. Denver's situation is less dramatic than Chicago's and less complex than Houston's, but it is a precise illustration of a problem that is playing out in dozens of mid-size American cities simultaneously. The city's rainy day fund balance has fallen to approximately 11% of spending. The city's own target is 15%. The gap exists because Denver has been using reserves to pay for operating expenses. Essentially, it has been spending its savings account to cover regular bills. In May 2025, facing a $200 million budget gap for fiscal year 2026, Denver's mayor ordered a hiring freeze and furlough days for city workers. That is what fiscal crisis looks like in real time. Not bankruptcy, not default, but hiring freezes, furloughs, services getting quietly slower and worse. The city operating as if it has fewer resources than it did, because it does. Denver experienced explosive appreciation in home values during the pandemic. It attracted remote workers, new businesses, and tax revenue. The city built its spending around that growth. The growth has now softened. The spending has not adjusted fast enough. The reserves are covering the gap for now, but reserves are finite. The structural imbalance will have to be addressed directly, or it will compound. The largest cities get the coverage because the numbers are largest, but the fiscal crisis is playing out proportionally harder in smaller cities, where there is no state backstop, no federal intervention mechanism, and no financial cushion at all. Chester, Pennsylvania has 33,000 people. The city went into state receivership because it could not manage its own finances. Its credit ratings fell to junk. Its pension obligations swallowed its revenue. Basic services, police, fire, and street maintenance became unreliable. Bridgeport, Connecticut, 150,000 people. Bridgeport faces a $57 million budget deficit on a city government with limited revenue options. The state of Connecticut has repeatedly intervened to keep the city from crossing the line into formal bankruptcy. East St. Louis, Illinois, 18,000 people, a tax base that has been shrinking since the 1960s, infrastructure that has been deteriorating for 50 years. The city's annual operating budget is a fraction of what it costs to provide even minimal services to its remaining population. It has been functionally insolvent for decades. It does not have the formal designation because Illinois has made the process complicated. Fairfield, Alabama, 10,000 people. Fairfield filed for Chapter 9. Bankruptcy in 2020 after U.S. Steel closed part of its facility and Walmart shut down. The local transit authority stopped running. The county had to take over the police force. The water authority threatened to shut off service. Fairfield is what happens when a city's only large employer decides it is no longer needed and leaves. These cities are not outliers. They are previews. Most people don't know what municipal bankruptcy actually means. It's different from corporate bankruptcy. A city cannot be liquidated. It has to keep providing services. Chapter 9. Bankruptcy protection allows a city to restructure its debts, renegotiate contracts, and stretch out payment schedules. It does not make the debt disappear. Detroit filed for Chapter 9 in July 2013. At the time, it was the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history, with more than $18 billion in debt. The bankruptcy process allowed the city to write down pension obligations, not eliminate them. Retired city workers received less than they had been promised. Bondholders received less than they were owed. The process took years, cost hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees, and left Detroit with a stigma that still affects its ability to borrow money at reasonable rates. Stockton, California filed for bankruptcy in 2012 with debts exceeding $700 million. It emerged from bankruptcy in 2015. The pension reform it achieved was limited because California law strongly protects pension obligations. Stockton emerged from bankruptcy still carrying pension costs that were eating its budget, the same costs that put it there in the first place. Vallejo, California filed for bankruptcy in 2008. The city emerged in 2011. The unfunded pension obligations that drove the bankruptcy were left largely untouched. By 2013, the city was staring at another deficit. Bankruptcy did not fix the underlying problem. It only bought time. The lesson from every major municipal bankruptcy is the same. The process is painful, slow, expensive, and inadequate. The workers who were promised pensions get less than they were promised. The bondholders who lent money at reasonable rates lose a portion. Residents see services get worse during and after the process. And the structural causes, the pension promises made faster than they could be funded and the revenue base that declined, are only partially addressed. Here's the part that most budget analysis ignores. The decisions that created these crises were not accidents. They were choices. Politicians promise generous retirement benefits to public workers because public workers vote, and promising future benefits costs nothing in the current budget cycle. Rating agencies accepted optimistic investment return assumptions for decades because their business model required good relationships with the issuers they rated. State legislatures set rules that protected pension obligations above all other creditors, making reform politically and legally difficult. Voters approved spending programs and simultaneously opposed tax increases, creating a structural gap that could only be papered over with debt and deferred obligations. Nobody was lying exactly. The promises were made in good faith, or at least with good enough faith. The math just never worked, and the bill is coming due now, all at once, in 20 of America's 25 largest cities simultaneously. The pandemic aid that kept the crisis at bay from 2020 to 2024 is gone. The one-time revenues are spent. The reserves are being drawn down. The structural problems are still there, now more exposed than they have ever been. 20 of 25 cities. Credit downgrades in Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. in a 5-month window. Houston is staring at a deficit of $330 million driven by flood damage. Denver's savings account is below its own target. New York is on credit watch. This is happening quietly. The cities are still open. The garbage is still getting picked up, mostly. The police are still responding to calls, with longer wait times. The potholes are getting fixed on a slower schedule. Everything is slightly worse than it was, and slightly worse than it will be next year and the year after. That is how cities go broke. Not all at once. Just a little more each year until one day the math stops working entirely. If you want to understand what happens after that, look at Detroit. Look at Stockton. Look at Fairfield, Alabama. The process takes a long time, but it is not slow in the ways that matter. It moves fast enough that by the time most people notice, the good options are already gone.